Bright Mart was more than just a grocery store. For the residents of Maplewood, it was a hub of memories, a place where stories began and lives intertwined. Bright Mart had stood for decades, and over time, it became a cornerstone of the town. Grandparents took their grandchildren there on lazy Saturday mornings, couples did their weekly shopping, and students from the local high school worked their first jobs stocking shelves or ringing up groceries. The store held a quiet sort of legacy, rooted deeply in the town's history. The aisles held stories. The staff, many of whom had been there for years, would recognize familiar faces, exchanging pleasantries with longtime customers. There was something unique about Bright Mart. It wasn't just the food, the deals, or the products. People felt comfortable there, as if it were an extension of their own kitchens and dining rooms. It was the type of place that felt like home even for those just passing through. But like any business, Bright Mart had to adapt to survive, and that meant modernizing. At the center of this modernization was Brad, the new manager. In his early 30s, Brad was sharp, ambitious, and well-dressed, a clear departure from the previous managers who had been part of the community for years. Brad was driven by numbers, efficiency, and profit. He believed that to keep Bright Mart relevant, it needed to focus on increasing its bottom line, catering to the latest trends, and running like a well-oiled machine. The family-friendly atmosphere was secondary in his mind, almost a quaint relic from the past. Brad strutted around the store, clipboard in hand, marking areas where he saw inefficiencies. He had introduced a strict dress code, limited casual employee interactions, and pushed his team to focus on upselling and cutting back on wasted time with customers. To him, Bright Mart was a job, a stepping stone to something greater, perhaps managing a larger chain or moving up in the company. The emotional connection that Maplewood residents felt for the store was simply lost on him. On that particular morning, as Brad walked the aisles, he glanced disapprovingly at an older employee chatting with a regular customer. He made a mental note to address this behavior in the next team meeting. Time was money, he often thought, and time wasted on small talk was money slipping through their fingers. He wanted to streamline Bright Mart, but his vision didn't align with the heart of the community. As he scanned the store with his critical eye, his thoughts drifted to a call he'd had with corporate the previous week. They had praised him for the initial spike in revenue but had advised that he also be mindful of the unique culture of the store. Brad shrugged it off. Numbers spoke louder than nostalgia, he thought. The way he saw it, Bright Mart needed a new image, one that matched the competitive market and kept profits steady. In the background of all his bustling and restructuring, Brad failed to notice how much the store's atmosphere had started to shift. Customers had begun to feel the subtle changes. Longtime shoppers noticed that the friendly interactions they once took for granted were becoming scarcer. Employees were more focused on tasks than people, and there was a sense that the warmth that had always defined Bright Mart was slowly slipping away. Brad, however, was unfazed. He was certain that his methods were improving the store's efficiency. And in his mind, anyone who wasn't on board simply didn't understand the demands of a competitive business. Yet, whispers were beginning to spread among the staff and customers alike. People quietly missed the friendly store that had once felt like a second home. Just as Brad was finishing his round of inspections that morning, his attention was drawn to an elderly woman entering the store. She moved slowly, with a warmth in her smile that seemed almost out of place amid the growing briskness of Bright Mart. She wore a simple, modest coat, and her eyes sparkled as she looked around, seemingly taking in the store as if she were seeing an old friend. She waved to a few of the employees, who greeted her with cautious smiles, aware of Brad's watchful eyes. The woman didn't fit the image of an ideal customer that Brad was trying to create. But something about her caught his attention. She moved with a sense of purpose, her eyes sharp as she surveyed the aisles. She nodded approvingly at the arrangement of the fruits and vegetables, paused to admire the newly stocked shelves, and even exchanged a few words with a young cashier. Brad found himself observing her, his curiosity piqued. Who was this woman? She didn't look like someone who belonged to the fast-paced world Brad envisioned for Bright Mart. Yet, the employees seemed to recognize her, treating her with a respect and familiarity that Brad couldn't quite understand. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. She was just another customer, after all, another person passing through the store. Brad returned to his checklist, but something about the woman lingered in his mind. He made a note to keep an eye on her, wondering if she might be a distraction for his team. After all, this was Brightmart now, his Brightmart. And he was determined to make sure everyone, including the customers, fit into his vision. Alice moved through the aisles of Brightmart with a quiet joy, savoring every corner as if each display held a memory. She was no stranger to the store or its people. Though she rarely visited anymore, she had been around since the beginning. Today, she felt a little spark of excitement, seeing how the market had grown and changed over the years. She looked at the fresh produce displays, the rows of neatly arranged canned goods, and smiled to herself, satisfied with how things looked. She didn't seem to be in a rush. Her soft blue eyes landed on each section with a gentle gaze, as though she were catching up with an old friend. A few employees stopped briefly to chat with her, their faces lighting up with warm smiles that felt almost out of place in the brisk, no-nonsense atmosphere that Brad had cultivated. One of the younger cashiers, a boy named Tyler, grinned as he saw Alice approaching. "Mrs. Alice," he greeted her, his face brightening. "Haven't seen you in a while. How've you been?" "Oh, Tyler, it's good to see you," she replied warmly, reaching out to pat his hand. "And I've been fine, thank you. It's lovely to be back here." Tyler beamed, and Alice felt her heart warm. Tyler reminded her of so many other young people she'd seen start at Brightmart. She knew the challenges of a first job and always made an effort to show kindness and encouragement. But today, her kindness was met with wary glances from other employees, who were keeping a close watch on Brad's whereabouts. As she moved on, Alice paused by the bakery section, where a familiar aroma filled the air. She closed her eyes, breathing it in, letting it bring back memories of the countless mornings she'd spent at the store, watching it come alive as the bakers prepared fresh bread. She noticed a young woman working in the section, placing freshly baked loaves onto a display. "Good morning, dear," Alice said, her voice as soft as her smile. "The bread looks wonderful today." The young woman blushed slightly, nodding. "Thank you, ma'am. We do our best." She glanced around nervously, noticing Brad at the far end of the store, but Alice didn't seem to pay it any mind. "That's all anyone can ask for," Alice replied, her tone comforting. She gave the young woman a nod and moved on, her gaze still scanning the shelves, appreciating the store's layout and the care taken in the displays. Alice's presence hadn't gone unnoticed. In the back of his mind, Brad remembered seeing her enter. He tried to stay focused on his notes, his task list, but found himself glancing in her direction more often than he wanted. Why was she moving through the store with such familiarity? And why were the employees giving her special attention? To Brad, she looked like any other elderly woman from town, modest and unassuming. Yet, something about her presence was undeniably magnetic, pulling people's attention. Her quiet presence seemed to soften the employees, drawing out small smiles and gentle interactions that Brad had tried so hard to reduce. After all, he believed time spent chatting was time taken from work. Growing impatient, Brad finally set down his clipboard. He'd had enough of the slow, casual atmosphere her presence seemed to bring. To him, the store had a mission to fulfill, and that mission didn't involve catering to visitors who wanted to linger and chat with his employees. He straightened his shoulders, ready to make his approach. Alice had stopped in front of a display of canned soups, her fingers lightly touching a can as if remembering something distant. She hadn't noticed Brad watching her from a few feet away, his face set in a look of growing irritation. With a sigh, she turned toward the deli section, seemingly oblivious to Brad's scrutiny. Brad's irritation only grew as he watched. Didn't this woman realize she was disrupting the flow of work? Steeling himself, Brad walked over, his shoes tapping against the polished tile floor. He stopped just close enough for her to hear the tap of his foot, waiting for her to turn around. When she finally looked up, he offered her a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ma'am," he began, his tone polite but strained, "is there something I can help you with?" Alice looked at him, mildly surprised, before giving him a warm smile. "Oh, I'm just looking around. I haven't been here in a while, and it's lovely to see how everything's coming along." "Well, if there's nothing you need, perhaps you could let the employees focus on their tasks," Brad said, his voice polite but clipped. "We have a busy day, and every bit of time counts." Alice blinked, taken aback for a moment, but then her face softened. "Oh, of course," she replied gently. "I didn't mean to get in the way." She gave him a small nod and moved toward another section of the store, leaving Brad watching her retreating figure with a mix of frustration and confusion. He couldn't quite understand it, but something about her made him feel unsettled. It was as though she saw right through him, through his carefully built facade of authority and confidence. But Brad brushed off the feeling, returning to his clipboard and tasks. He watched as she continued her slow, intentional walk around the store, quietly greeting employees and surveying the shelves, her eyes lingering on each section with a look of familiarity. He mentally noted her face and movements, wondering who exactly she was and why she seemed so at home in his store. As Alice continued through the aisles, oblivious to the lingering looks of both Brad and the employees, she felt a warmth swell inside her. Though the store's atmosphere had changed, she could still see the heart of Brightmart in the people who worked there. And for Alice, that heart was what truly mattered. With one last look around, she let out a soft, contented sigh. The market had grown and changed, but as long as people could find kindness here, she thought, it would always feel like home. Brad's eyes followed Alice as she moved from one section of the store to another, her calm demeanor an uncomfortable contrast to his impatience. He watched her strike up a friendly conversation with a cashier, then saw her pause in the produce section, admiring the arrangement with an approving nod. Each interaction she had seemed to bring the employees a small sense of ease, softening their tension even if just for a moment. It only served to irritate Brad further, though he couldn't exactly explain why. Finally, he couldn't hold back any longer. With his clipboard tucked tightly under his arm, he strode purposefully toward her. Alice was standing near the fresh produce, carefully inspecting an apple as if savoring every detail. She was talking to one of the older employees, Mr. James, who'd been with the store for years. Mr. James listened attentively, nodding at whatever Alice was saying, a gentle smile on his face. Brad cleared his throat, louder than necessary, drawing both their attention. Mr. James's face fell slightly, and Alice turned to Brad with a pleasant smile, as if she had been expecting nothing less than friendliness in return. "Excuse me, ma'am," Brad began, his voice sharp. "We're running a business here, and I'd appreciate it if our employees could stay focused on their tasks." He looked pointedly at Mr. James, who quietly nodded and slipped back to his work, casting a quick, apologetic glance at Alice. "Oh, I didn't mean to keep anyone from working," Alice replied, her voice as warm as ever. "I just wanted to see how everyone's doing. I've missed this place." Brad's expression hardened. "Well, this isn't exactly a social club. We have goals to meet, and every minute counts." Alice held his gaze, surprised by his tone, though she maintained her calm demeanor. "I understand," she said softly. "But sometimes a friendly word can make the workday just a little bit brighter." Brad scoffed slightly, barely disguising his irritation. "With all due respect, ma'am, we don't have time for distractions. If you're not here to shop, I'd appreciate it if you could." Alice's face softened as she interrupted, still calm. "I was just admiring how well everything is organized. It's clear that you're taking good care of the place." For a moment, Brad was caught off guard. Her words were gentle, and her face reflected genuine admiration. He had been expecting her to be defensive or apologetic, but her response felt more like an invitation to see the store from her perspective. Yet, he quickly pushed the thought aside, unable to shake his frustration. "Well, I appreciate your interest," Brad said curtly. "But as I said, we're busy, and we need to keep things running efficiently. If you're not here to make a purchase, it might be best to." She nodded, cutting him off again, though her tone remained soft. "I understand. I'll be on my way soon." The customers nearby pretended not to notice, but a subtle tension hung in the air. Brad's irritation grew, feeling as though he had lost control over the situation. His vision for Brightmart didn't include elderly women strolling through the aisles, chatting and disrupting his employees' focus. The place needed order, precision, and productivity, qualities that left no room for nostalgic wanderings. Seeing that she wasn't planning on leaving right away, he felt his patience fray even further. Alice's calm, gentle responses unsettled him, as though she knew something he didn't. Who was she to ignore his authority? Who was she to question how he chose to run the store? "Look," Brad said, a bit more forcefully. "I'm asking you to respect the fact that this is a business. Our employees have responsibilities, and I'd rather they weren't distracted by visitors." Alice tilted her head slightly, studying him. There was a wisdom in her eyes, a knowingness that made him shift uncomfortably. "Of course," she said finally, her voice just as calm as it had been. "I didn't mean to intrude." She gave him a small, understanding smile, as though she'd seen right through him and forgiven him for his outburst. Brad clenched his jaw, frustrated that she was leaving on her own terms, as if his words had no effect on her. She nodded at him kindly, then turned and started to walk toward the front of the store. Watching her go, Brad's annoyance mixed with something else, something he couldn't quite place, a gnawing unease that lingered even as she disappeared down the aisle. His shoulders remained tense as he scanned the store, noticing that some of his employees seemed affected by the exchange. They went back to work quickly enough, but the glances and low murmurs that had begun spreading made it clear that they, too, had been touched by Alice's presence. Brad shook his head, forcing himself to focus. He couldn't let one woman, no matter how much she reminded him of a simpler, more sentimental version of Brightmart, undermine his vision for the store. Back to work, he muttered under his breath, as if trying to dispel the tension that still clung to the air. He reminded himself of his mission, of the purpose he'd set for himself when he took the manager position, to turn Brightmart into a model of efficiency and profit, a business that met the demands of the modern world. And if that meant making some changes to its friendly atmosphere, so be it. But even as he refocused on his task list, Brad couldn't shake the image of Alice's knowing smile and the unsettling feeling that she wasn't just another visitor passing through. He dismissed the thought, turning his attention back to his clipboard, but he couldn't ignore the whispers spreading among the employees and the faint feeling that he had somehow misjudged the situation. Alice had intended to leave quietly, letting her pleasant visit to the store end on a positive note. But as she reached the front of the store, she noticed a display of canned soups that brought back memories of the early days of Brightmart. She paused, picking up a can of tomato soup and smiling to herself. She remembered the time she had worked long hours stocking these very shelves, ensuring everything looked perfect for the customers. Brad, however, was still watching her closely, his annoyance growing by the second. The fact that she hadn't left yet seemed almost like a deliberate act of defiance in his mind. He approached her with brisk steps, his frustration now fully visible. Alice, engrossed in her memories, didn't notice him until he was right beside her. "Ma'am," he said, his tone steely and firm. "I thought we discussed this. We're trying to keep a productive environment here, and we really can't afford distractions. If you're not here to shop, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Alice turned to him, her expression softening. She could see the tension in his face, the impatience in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, still holding the can of soup. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I just wanted to look around a bit, reminisce. It's been such a long time." Brad felt his irritation flare. He didn't care about her nostalgia or whatever memories she was reliving. He just wanted her out, and her calmness seemed almost mocking to him. "This isn't some kind of museum," he said coldly, his voice lowering. "If you want to relive old memories, there are probably better places than a grocery store." A few employees who were nearby paused, looking in Alice's direction. They seemed surprised, even a bit distressed, by the harsh tone in Brad's voice. Alice met Brad's gaze with steady eyes, but her warm expression never faltered. "I understand," she replied softly, her calmness unnerving him further. "I didn't mean to offend anyone." Brad let out a short, dismissive sigh. "It's not about offense. It's about time." Our employees have things to do, and we're trying to meet goals here. I can't have customers, especially those who aren't buying, distracting them." Alice's expression shifted slightly, a faint look of sadness passing across her face. She looked down at the can of soup in her hand, then back up at Brad, as if weighing whether to respond or simply walk away. A few nearby customers were now watching the exchange, sensing the uncomfortable tension. Some of the employees, particularly those who had known Alice for years, wore uneasy expressions, but none dared to step forward or speak up. Mr. James, the older employee who had spoken to Alice earlier, looked down at the floor, a mixture of regret and frustration on his face. "I'm sorry to be a bother," Alice said, a small smile flickering at the corners of her mouth. "I won't stay long. I just wanted to see how things have changed." Brad crossed his arms, feeling that he finally had the upper hand. "Good," he said, his tone sharp. "Because frankly, this isn't a place for wandering around aimlessly. If you're not here to buy, then I'd really appreciate it if you could let us do our jobs." Alice nodded, still holding his gaze with a look that was gentle yet knowing, as if she understood far more than he did. She placed the can back on the shelf and turned to walk toward the door, moving slowly, each step filled with a quiet dignity. The customers nearby watched her go, their expressions a mix of sympathy and surprise. The employees, too, looked after her, their faces etched with discomfort. Brad couldn't help but feel a flash of triumph as she walked away, as if he'd won some kind of unspoken battle. But there was also something else, a sense of unease that he couldn't quite shake. It gnawed at him, making him feel unsettled even as he convinced himself that he'd done the right thing. He turned back to his clipboard, trying to refocus on his tasks. But the store felt different. The quiet, watchful eyes of the employees were on him, their usual energy dampened by the confrontation they had just witnessed. Brad ignored their glances, determined to maintain control, yet the faint whispers began to spread, soft murmurs that he couldn't quite ignore. A young cashier near the registers leaned over to a fellow employee, whispering in disbelief, "Did you see how he spoke to her? She didn't deserve that." Another employee, a woman who had been with Brightmart for years, muttered under her breath, "If he only knew who she was." Brad's ears caught fragments of their conversation, and he bristled. He didn't understand why they felt the need to defend an elderly woman who, in his eyes, was disrupting their workflow. This was exactly the kind of softness he had been working to remove from Brightmart, the excess friendliness and emotional ties that, in his mind, only slowed things down. But no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, he couldn't escape the subtle shift in the store's atmosphere. The employees moved about their tasks with less enthusiasm, their expressions subdued. Customers, too, sensed the tension, looking between the employees and Brad, as though trying to piece together what had happened. Mr. James, the longtime employee, quietly continued his work, but his usual warm demeanor was absent. He moved with a heaviness, casting furtive glances toward the entrance where Alice had exited. A few employees looked to him, silently wondering if he would say something, but he remained silent, too well aware of Brad's strict management style to risk causing a scene. As Brad resumed his duties, he couldn't escape the whispers that continued to ripple through the store. The words were hushed, but their impact was palpable. It was as if Alice's brief presence had left a mark, and her quiet dignity in the face of Brad's harshness lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Even though Brad couldn't understand the employees' reactions, he forced himself to brush it off. He had a job to do, goals to meet, and a store to manage. In his mind, sentimentality and personal attachments were distractions that didn't belong in a business setting. If his employees couldn't see that, then perhaps they would have to adjust, or move on. But as he walked away from the front of the store, clipboard in hand, a nagging thought crept into his mind, making him pause briefly. Who exactly was this woman who seemed to have such an effect on his employees? Why had her presence stirred such a reaction? Brad shook his head, unwilling to dwell on it. He had work to do, and whatever hold she had over his staff was irrelevant to him. Still, as he continued his rounds, the feeling of unease persisted, lingering like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. Brad returned to his rounds, clipboard in hand, determined to regain his focus. Yet, the air felt different. There was a quiet tension that hummed just beneath the surface, and every now and then, he caught snippets of whispered conversations among the employees. They were subtle, but unmistakable, a word here, a gesture there. Brad clenched his jaw, doing his best to ignore it, but it was clear that something was lingering in the minds of those around him. As he passed by the bakery section, he noticed Tyler, the young cashier, chatting quietly with Mr. James. The older man's expression was one of frustration, and though Tyler spoke in hushed tones, Brad could feel their glances occasionally darting in his direction. He stopped, pretending to examine his notes, but his ears strained to pick up fragments of their conversation. "I just don't get it, Mr. James," Tyler whispered, his face a mix of confusion and indignation. "She was nothing but kind, and he just snapped at her. She didn't deserve that." Mr. James nodded slowly, his voice calm but laced with an edge of disappointment. "Young folks these days don't always understand respect. That woman's done more for this store than he'll ever know." Brad felt a spark of irritation at the comment, even if he wasn't entirely sure what it meant. He cleared his throat, and both men fell silent immediately, resuming their work with lowered heads. The interruption had ended the conversation, but it did little to dispel the tension in the air. As he moved further down the aisle, Brad overheard another exchange between two employees who were restocking shelves in the cleaning supplies section. A woman named Carla, who had been with Brightmart for over a decade, shook her head as she arranged bottles of cleaner, her voice barely above a murmur. "He doesn't understand," Carla said, glancing furtively around. "If he only knew who she was." Her coworker, a younger woman named Jen, looked up, her face filled with curiosity. "What do you mean? Who is she?" Carla hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if to ensure Brad wasn't nearby. "That woman. Alice, she's the heart of this place. She built this store from the ground up. I mean, she's the reason half of us have jobs here." But her voice trailed off, and she shook her head again, clearly at a loss. Jen's eyes widened, and she looked in the direction of the exit where Alice had left. "You mean she?" Carla nodded solemnly. "Yeah. She's the founder. She's been a part of this place since before he even thought about taking this job. She might not run the day-to-day, but she's still the one who built Brightmart into what it is." Jen looked stunned, her gaze flickering back and forth as if piecing together a puzzle. Brad felt his stomach twist as he absorbed their words. Founder? Owner? He struggled to connect this with the image of the modestly dressed, elderly woman he had dismissed so quickly. But before he could process his thoughts, Carla and Jen caught sight of him and fell silent, their faces shifting to blank professionalism as they continued restocking the shelves. A sense of unease crept into Brad's mind, clouding his usually sharp focus. Could it be true? Could that quiet, humble woman really be the owner of Brightmart? It seemed impossible. Surely, if she held that position, someone in corporate would have informed him. Yet, the employees' reactions were too genuine to dismiss. Brad found himself wandering back to the entrance, as if expecting to see Alice reappear, ready to clear up the confusion. His thoughts raced, each question spinning into the next. Had he really just humiliated the founder of Brightmart? And if so, what would the consequences be? He didn't have long to wonder. Just as he approached the front desk, he felt his phone buzz in his pocket. A call from corporate. His heart skipped a beat as he accepted the call, keeping his voice steady despite the sudden apprehension gnawing at him. "Brad, this is Linda from corporate. I wanted to check in with you," came the voice on the other end, warm but businesslike. "I understand you had a visitor at the store this morning?" Brad's pulse quickened. "Yes, we had a few customers this morning," he replied carefully, already feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Actually, I'm referring specifically to Alice," Linda clarified, her tone taking on a note of quiet gravity. "Alice Caldwell. I believe you're aware that she's the founder and owner of Brightmart. She visited the store today, didn't she?" The words hit Brad like a blow. He swallowed hard, his voice faltering slightly. Yes, she was here. I didn't know. There was a pause on the other end of the line. We assumed she wouldn't need an introduction, Linda continued, her voice now tinged with a hint of reproach. Alice has always taken an interest in the well-being of Brightmark and its employees. She wanted to see how things were going under your management. Brad's mind spun, replaying the events of the morning in vivid detail. He felt the embarrassment flooding his face as he remembered his dismissive words, his insistence that she was a distraction, his cold demand that she leave if she wasn't shopping. The weight of his own arrogance was beginning to settle on him, pressing heavily. I didn't realize who she was, Brad stammered, the reality sinking in painfully. She didn't mention anything. She just looked like, he stopped himself, realizing how shallow his words sounded. She doesn't usually need to mention anything, Linda replied pointedly. She's never been one to flaunt her role, but her presence speaks for itself. The community knows her, Brad, and so does the staff. I'm afraid they might not respond well if they think their new manager doesn't respect her. Brad felt his chest tighten, the gravity of his mistake settling over him like a thick fog. He could sense Linda's disappointment, even over the phone, and he knew he'd have to tread carefully. Is there anything I can do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, almost ashamed to ask. Linda sighed. I suggest you start with an apology, she said simply. Alice is kind, but she doesn't tolerate disrespect. She has a deep love for that store and everyone in it. You'll have to work hard to regain the trust you may have lost today. The call ended with a click, leaving Brad standing alone near the front of the store, the phone still clutched in his hand. He could feel the stares of his employees, their eyes following his every move. His heart sank as he realized that in his blind ambition, he had failed to see the very values that had made Brightmark special. For the first time since he had taken the job, Brad felt lost. His confidence was shaken, and he was suddenly uncertain of his place in the very store he managed. The thought of facing Alice, of looking her in the eye and acknowledging his mistake, filled him with dread. But he knew he had no choice. He'd have to find a way to make it right, if she would even allow him the chance. Brad stood in the middle of the store, feeling the weight of his actions settle heavily on his shoulders. His mind raced with images of Alice, her warm, understanding smile, the gentle way she had responded to his dismissiveness, and the knowing look in her eyes as she walked away. Now, with each glance from his employees, he understood the true gravity of what he'd done. He hadn't simply embarrassed a kind, elderly customer, he had disrespected the very person who had built Brightmark from the ground up. In an attempt to shake off the overwhelming sense of guilt, Brad retreated to his office. He closed the door, leaning against it for a moment before sinking into his chair, his head in his hands. His mind kept replaying the scene over and over. He had dismissed her as a distraction, ordered her to leave if she wasn't shopping, and made it clear that her presence wasn't welcome. He had treated her as though she were an inconvenience when, in reality, she was the heart of everything Brightmark stood for. A knock on the door broke his thoughts, and he quickly straightened, attempting to gather himself. He took a deep breath, trying to summon his usual composure. "Come in," he called, his voice strained but steady. Linda from corporate entered, her expression carefully neutral. She took a seat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. There was a moment of silence, during which she simply looked at him, her eyes reflecting both disappointment and something close to empathy. "Brad," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I think it's clear that there's a misunderstanding here, and we need to address it." Brad nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I didn't know. I had no idea she was the founder." "She didn't look like," he trailed off, realizing how shallow his reasoning sounded, even to himself. Linda's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained serious. "That's the thing about Alice. She's never cared much for appearances or titles. She built Brightmark as a place for the community, not just a business. To her, the employees, the customers, and the values of respect and kindness are what truly matter." Brad nodded, a wave of shame washing over him. He realized now just how out of place his strict, profit-driven mindset had been in a store built on such fundamentally different principles. Linda's words brought everything into sharp focus, and he felt a sense of loss, like he had misunderstood the very essence of his role. Brad, Alice has spent her life building a store where people feel welcome, where employees feel valued, Linda continued, her tone firm yet compassionate. She treats everyone with respect because she believes that's the foundation of a good business. And that's what she wanted to see here today. Brad closed his eyes, taking in her words. He couldn't shake the image of Alice's face as she'd looked at him, her kindness unbroken despite his harshness. He had been so focused on efficiency and control that he had missed the larger picture entirely. "I'll apologize to her," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "If she'll even listen to me." Linda gave him a measured nod. "That would be a start. Alice is forgiving, but she values sincerity. I don't think it's too late to make things right, Brad, but you'll have to show her, and the entire staff, that you truly understand what went wrong." She stood, giving him a final, steady look. "Actions speak louder than words. Show her that you're willing to respect the values she's built this place on. And perhaps, over time, you'll find that this store has more to offer than just numbers and profits." With that, Linda left, closing the door quietly behind her. Brad sat in silence, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time, he understood how his actions had hurt not only Alice but also the entire team that looked up to her as the heart of Brightmart. His drive for results had blinded him to the people who made those results possible, and now, he was faced with the consequences. After a moment, he stood, taking a deep breath. He knew what he had to do. Brad left his office and headed toward the front of the store. A few employees glanced up as he walked by, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The whispers had spread quickly, and he could feel the judgment in their eyes. He couldn't blame them, they had every right to feel disappointed. He approached Mr. James, who was restocking items in one of the middle aisles. The older man looked up, surprised to see Brad standing there, and gave him a nod that was cordial but guarded. "Mr. James," Brad began, struggling to find the right words. I owe you, and everyone here, an apology. I realize that I acted in a way that goes against what this store represents. I didn't understand who Alice was, and I certainly didn't understand what Brightmart means to all of you." Mr. James regarded him silently, his expression unreadable. Brad swallowed, continuing, "I'd like to make things right, starting with Alice. Do you know where I might find her? I'd like to speak with her, if she'll allow it." A brief look of surprise crossed Mr. James's face, followed by a slow nod. "She likes to spend her afternoons in the park down by Maplewood Avenue. She goes there to think, to enjoy the quiet." Brad nodded, gratitude and nervousness mingling in his chest. "Thank you. And, thank you for your patience. I know I have a lot to learn." With a final nod, he made his way to the store's exit, feeling the eyes of his employees following him. He didn't know if they believed he could change, but he was determined to prove himself. He had been given a second chance, an opportunity to learn from his mistakes, and he wouldn't take it lightly. As he walked toward the small park a few blocks from Brightmart, he thought about everything he had learned that day. He realized that Alice hadn't needed to assert her authority or remind him of her position. Her gentle approach and unwavering kindness had done more to teach him about leadership than any business class he had ever taken. Arriving at the park, Brad spotted Alice sitting on a wooden bench, her gaze fixed on the blooming flowers along the path. She looked peaceful, as if the morning's events hadn't weighed on her at all. Brad approached slowly, unsure of how to start, but determined to show her the respect she deserved. When he reached her, she looked up, her face softening into a gentle smile as she recognized him. She didn't say anything, waiting for him to speak first. Brad took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with humility. "Mrs. Caldwell. Alice. I owe you an apology. I treated you with disrespect, and I'm ashamed of how I acted. I didn't realize who you were, but that's no excuse. I let my own ambitions cloud my judgment, and I forgot what truly matters here." Alice listened in silence, her gaze unwavering, her expression thoughtful. "I want to do better, Brad continued, his voice barely above a whisper. If you'll allow me, I'd like to learn from you, to understand what this store really means. I want to earn back the trust I've lost. Alice's smile widened, her eyes crinkling at the corners. That's a good start, she said softly. Brightmart is more than just a store, Brad. It's a place where people can feel seen and valued. If you're willing to see that, then I believe you'll do just fine. Brad felt a sense of relief wash over him, mixed with the weight of responsibility. He knew that this was only the beginning of his journey to becoming the kind of leader Alice had hoped to see. And as they sat together in the quiet park, he realized that this moment, humbling and difficult, was the first step toward building a Brightmart that truly honored her legacy. Sitting on the park bench beside Alice, Brad felt an unfamiliar vulnerability. His usual composure, the confident demeanor he carried as Brightmart's manager, was nowhere to be found. Instead, he was stripped down to a simple, humbled man seeking redemption for a mistake he could hardly believe he'd made. Alice, meanwhile, remained calm and welcoming, as if she had already anticipated this moment. The gentle understanding in her eyes was both a comfort and a mirror reflecting his regret. Thank you for giving me a chance to speak, Brad began, his voice tight with the weight of his apology. I know I acted in a way that, well, that doesn't deserve your kindness. I was so focused on my goals, on trying to make Brightmart as efficient as possible, that I lost sight of the values you built it on. Alice listened, nodding thoughtfully. Her silence encouraged him to keep going, to speak openly about his remorse. It's not an excuse, Brad continued, struggling to keep his voice steady. But I was so consumed with the numbers, the targets, the things corporate seemed to prioritize, that I stopped seeing people. You showed me that the heart of this store isn't in its productivity or profit margins. It's in the people who keep it alive, the ones who call Brightmart home. Alice smiled softly. Brad, I appreciate your honesty. And I want you to know that forgiveness is easy when there's true regret. Brightmart isn't just a store to me, it's a place for the community, for people to feel they belong. And that means treating everyone, whether employee or customer, with respect. Brad nodded, feeling a weight lift as he took in her words. But there was still a pang of doubt in his chest. He had wounded the spirit of the store, the very essence that Alice had built with her heart and soul. Could an apology, even a sincere one, be enough to restore what he had taken away? I want to make it right, he said earnestly, his gaze meeting hers. Not just with you, but with everyone at Brightmart. The staff, they looked up to you, and I can see now how much they respected you. They deserved better from me. I can't just fix this with words. I need to show them I've changed. Alice nodded approvingly. That's true, Brad. Actions are the proof of change, and I believe you'll find that the staff will be willing to forgive, but they'll need to see your sincerity in practice. They know that mistakes happen. What they value most is the effort to make things right. A sense of calm settled over Brad, though he felt the gravity of the work ahead. He knew he would need to start from scratch, to rebuild not only his reputation but also the sense of belonging and respect that Alice had fostered in Brightmart. She had handed him the blueprint, and it was now up to him to follow it. Thank you, he murmured. Thank you for this chance, and for showing me what Brightmart truly means. I'm committed to honoring what you've built. Alice's face softened, her smile growing warmer. I believe you, Brad. And I think you'll find that everyone else will, too, in time. It's never easy to admit when we've lost sight of what's important. But the willingness to learn, to grow, that's what makes a real leader. Brad felt a deep sense of gratitude fill him. He rose from the bench, nodding respectfully to Alice, feeling both lighter and more grounded than he had in a long time. As he made his way back to Brightmart, he felt a renewed determination. He knew that transforming his relationship with the store and its staff wouldn't happen overnight. But he was ready to show them, through his actions and his attitude, that he was capable of change. When he arrived, he was greeted by curious, watchful eyes. The employees knew something was different. The whispers and wary glances remained, but there was also a glimmer of hope, an unspoken willingness to see if Brad could become the kind of leader Brightmart deserved. His first stop was the break room, where a few employees were gathered on a short rest. They looked up, surprised to see him there, and a hushed silence filled the room. Brad took a deep breath, the reality of the moment settling over him. "I wanted to talk to you all," he began, his tone uncharacteristically gentle. "About this morning. I owe each of you an apology. The way I handled things was wrong, and I realize now that I disrespected not only Alice but also every one of you. You all deserve better, and I'm sorry." A few employees exchanged surprised glances, clearly caught off guard. They hadn't expected an apology, least of all from Brad. "I let my own ambitions and expectations cloud my judgment," he continued, his voice steady. "But Alice reminded me of something important, that this store isn't just about profits or efficiency. It's about community. It's about creating a place where everyone feels valued. And that includes each and every one of you." Tyler, the young cashier, nodded slightly, the beginnings of a smile forming on his face. The room was silent, but Brad could feel the tension gradually easing, the skeptical look softening. His sincerity was reaching them, and he felt the beginnings of a fragile trust forming. "I know that I'll have to earn back your respect, and I don't expect it to happen all at once," Brad added, his tone humble. "But I'm committed to making Brightmart a place that honors the values Alice instilled here. I want to make this right." Carla, one of the longest-serving employees, regarded him carefully before nodding. "I appreciate you saying that, Brad. I think we all do." Her words carried weight, and the others nodded in agreement, showing signs of acceptance. As he left the break room, a sense of hope stirred in Brad's heart. He felt, perhaps for the first time, that he was on the right path. The journey ahead would be challenging, and he knew he would need patience, humility, and consistent effort to mend the relationships he had strained. But he was willing to do the work, knowing that each step forward was a step toward honoring Alice's legacy. From that moment on, Brad approached his work with a different perspective. Instead of just observing productivity and efficiency, he focused on supporting his employees, encouraging their strengths, and acknowledging their contributions. He took the time to listen to them, to ask about their lives, and to treat them as partners in Brightmart's success rather than mere workers. Alice's words echoed in his mind, guiding him through each interaction, reminding him of what true leadership meant. And as the days went by, he noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. Smiles returned, conversations grew friendlier, and Brightmart began to feel, once again, like the welcoming, vibrant community hub it was meant to be. Brad's apology, paired with his genuine efforts to improve, had earned him a tentative but growing respect among the staff. They were cautious, yes, but also encouraged by the noticeable changes in his behavior. And as he continued to put Alice's teachings into practice, he found himself embracing a new sense of purpose, a purpose that went beyond the walls of the store, touching lives and building connections that he had once overlooked. For the first time, Brad felt that he truly belonged at Brightmart. And with each step forward, he felt closer to the person Alice had quietly believed he could become. In the weeks that followed, Brad dedicated himself to transforming not only Brightmart but also himself. The lessons Alice had gently imparted lingered in his mind, guiding him to see the store and its people through a different lens. Every interaction, every decision, now carried a weight that it hadn't before. Instead of focusing on efficiency alone, Brad began to consider how each choice he made impacted the lives around him. He implemented small changes at first, subtle shifts in his management style that reflected his newfound respect for the team. Rather than rushing through his rounds with clipboard in hand, he would pause to ask employees about their work, offering genuine words of encouragement. He realized how much the staff appreciated these small acts, and as he continued to make time for them, he noticed the warmth returning to the store. Brad also made a point to meet with each team member one-on-one, listening to their ideas and concerns. Carla, the longtime employee who had stood up to him, shared her thoughts on improving customer service, and Brad found himself learning from her insight. Tyler, the young cashier, expressed his passion for learning about retail operations, and Brad began mentoring him, sharing what he'd learned about business, tempered now by his understanding of people. Bit by bit, Brad was beginning to rebuild the trust he had broken. The employees responded to his sincerity, warming up to him in a way that they never had before. He saw smiles returning to their faces, heard laughter in the break room, and sensed the easing of the tense atmosphere that had once filled the store. Brightmart was beginning to feel like the community it had always been, a place where everyone felt valued and connected. One afternoon, Brad was stocking shelves with Mr. James, who had watched his transformation with quiet approval. Mr. James had been a mentor to many of the younger staff, a patient, wise presence who treated everyone with respect. Brad realized, as they worked side by side, just how much Mr. James had contributed to the spirit of Brightmart over the years. "Mr. James," Brad began, his voice softening, "I want to thank you. Not just for your patience with me, but for everything you do here. I see now how much this place means to you and everyone else. I'm grateful for what I've learned from you." Mr. James paused, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Brad, we've all had things to learn at some point. And I think it's safe to say you've learned yours. This place is better because of it." The words warmed Brad's heart. He felt as though he were finally beginning to earn the respect of those around him, not through authority but through shared purpose and trust. Days turned into weeks, and Brad continued to make changes that reflected the values Alice had championed. He implemented a new policy encouraging open communication, making sure that employees felt comfortable sharing their ideas and feedback. Brad saw this as a way to honor the legacy Alice had left, a reminder that the store's heart was in its people. He also organized a small appreciation event for the employees, something Alice had often done in the past. He invited everyone to a casual evening at the store, where they could enjoy refreshments, swap stories, and relax as a team. Brad used the opportunity to thank each employee personally, acknowledging their contributions and reminding them of how essential they were to Brightmart's success. At the event, Brad noticed the transformation of the store in an entirely new way. The space was filled with laughter, warmth, and camaraderie, a stark contrast to the brisk, business-driven environment he had once enforced. Seeing everyone together, enjoying the fruits of their hard work, he realized just how far he had come, and how much Brightmart had taught him about true leadership. During the evening, Carla approached him, a warm smile lighting up her face. "You know, Brad, you've done a lot to bring us back together," she said. "It means a lot that you've taken the time to understand what this place really means to us." Brad nodded, feeling a deep sense of pride. "Thank you, Carla. It's been quite a journey. I have Alice to thank for showing me what matters. I want to make sure Brightmart keeps that spirit alive." Carla nodded approvingly, her eyes glinting with respect. Alice would be proud. She always believed that the store could be more than just a business. She believed it could be a place where people felt at home. As the evening came to an end, Brad felt a profound sense of gratitude. He saw the employees leaving with smiles on their faces, each one carrying a renewed sense of belonging and pride in the place they worked. He knew that the path to fully restoring the trust and warmth Alice had cultivated would take time, but he was prepared to walk that path every day, growing alongside his team. Reflecting on the lessons he had learned, Brad knew that he was no longer the same manager who had once demanded efficiency at the expense of humanity. He had become a part of the community that Alice had worked so hard to build, a community bound by shared values of kindness, respect, and support. As he locked up the store that night, Brad felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he was finally honoring Alice's vision. He was leading Brightmart not just as a store, but as a place that truly belonged to the people. Brad arrived early at the store the next morning, still energized by the sense of unity he had felt at the appreciation event the night before. The store felt alive with the warmth and pride that Alice had envisioned from the beginning, and now, Brad was seeing it firsthand. He'd spent years in management, but never had he felt so connected to the people he worked alongside. And with each day, he felt more dedicated to ensuring Brightmart remained the welcoming, community-centered space it was always meant to be. In the weeks following his apology and renewed commitment, Brad introduced a few new changes that reflected his evolving understanding of leadership. One of his first actions was to implement an open-door policy, encouraging employees to come to him directly with any concerns or ideas. Rather than simply managing from a distance, he wanted to build trust by showing that he was listening and invested in their perspectives. To demonstrate this, he held monthly meetings where everyone was invited to share suggestions. The first of these meetings was met with cautious optimism from the staff. Some were hesitant, but as Brad welcomed each idea with genuine interest, the atmosphere began to shift. Employees who had once kept to themselves started opening up, voicing ideas about inventory organization, customer service improvements, and even small aesthetic changes that could make the store feel cozier and more inviting. One idea came from Tyler, who suggested creating a community board near the entrance where local events and news could be posted. Brad loved the concept, it aligned perfectly with the values Alice had fostered, and he encouraged Tyler to lead the project. Over the next week, Tyler and a few other employees designed a colorful, welcoming board where customers could share announcements about local events, fundraisers, and community gatherings. The board quickly became a popular feature of the store, and customers often paused to read the latest updates, sometimes leaving their own notes or posting flyers. It was a simple addition, but it added a sense of connection that resonated with Brightmart's mission. Brad was thrilled to see it thriving and felt a deep sense of satisfaction watching Tyler grow into a more confident, engaged team member. As more ideas came forward, Brad noticed a collective pride developing among the employees. Each new project brought them closer together, and they began to feel a shared responsibility for the success of the store. Mr. James, who had always been a respected figure among the staff, began offering suggestions on ways to improve efficiency without sacrificing the store's friendly, approachable vibe. Carla took the lead in organizing a weekly meeting where the team could discuss challenges and celebrate successes, reinforcing a spirit of collaboration. One of the most meaningful changes Brad introduced was a Customer Appreciation Day. Inspired by Alice's tradition of celebrating community, he dedicated one Saturday a month to offering small discounts, free samples, and even little surprises like homemade cookies baked by Carla, who was known for her treats. The first Customer Appreciation Day was met with enthusiasm from the town, and Brightmart was flooded with shoppers who expressed their gratitude for the event. During that day, Brad moved through the aisles, helping customers and chatting with them. He heard stories from longtime patrons who remembered Alice in her early days building Brightmart from the ground up. Many of them were touched to see that her spirit was still very much alive in the store, and Brad felt a profound sense of honor knowing he was part of continuing her legacy. As the day came to an end, a customer approached Brad, an older woman who had been visiting Brightmart for years. She smiled warmly and said, "It's nice to see Brightmart thriving with so much love and care. This place always felt like more than just a store to me. It feels like family." Her words struck a chord deep within Brad. This was the essence of Alice's vision, a vision that he had once dismissed in favor of efficiency and profit margins. Now, he understood that Brightmart's strength wasn't in its sales numbers or its streamlined operations, but in the relationships it built and the community it supported. As he locked up the store that night, Brad reflected on how far he had come since that fateful day when he dismissed Alice as nothing more than a distraction. The person he was now seemed worlds apart from the man who had once believed Brightmart should run like a rigid machine. He realized that Alice's influence had reshaped his understanding of leadership, showing him that true success lay in creating a place where people felt valued and seen. In the following weeks, Brad continued to build on the changes he had implemented, but he also focused on his own growth. He took time each morning to greet the staff, to ask about their lives, and to make them feel like essential parts of the store's success. His transformation hadn't gone unnoticed. Employees who once approached him with apprehension now greeted him with genuine smiles. There was a new atmosphere of openness and warmth, a rekindled sense of pride that permeated every corner of the store. Alice visited occasionally, her presence always sparking a mix of joy and admiration among the employees. She would walk the aisles, nodding approvingly at the displays, occasionally stopping to share a warm word with Mr. James or Carla. When she'd encounter Brad, she'd offer him a gentle smile and a nod that conveyed a quiet respect. They shared an unspoken understanding, a bond forged through humility and growth, and Brad felt deep gratitude for the guidance she had given him. One afternoon, as Alice was leaving, Brad walked her to the door, his heart filled with appreciation. "Thank you, Alice," he said, his voice sincere. "For everything. I don't think I would have understood what this place truly means if it weren't for you." Alice smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's a pleasure, Brad. Brightmart needed you, too. Every place needs someone willing to learn and grow. And now, thanks to you, it has a brighter future than ever." As she walked out the door, Brad felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that Brightmart's journey was far from over, and that there would be challenges ahead. But with Alice's guidance in his heart and the unwavering support of the staff, he felt ready for whatever the future held. Brightmart had indeed become more than just a store. It was a place where people cared for one another, where kindness and respect were valued above all else. And Brad knew that as long as he remained true to Alice's vision, the store would continue to thrive, a beacon of community and compassion in the heart of the town. The months that followed brought continued growth for both Brad and Brightmart. The store had flourished into a place that truly reflected the values Alice had envisioned, a community-centered space where kindness and respect were central. Brad, who had once seen himself as merely a manager, now found his role intertwined with the lives of his employees, the customers, and the town itself. Brightmart had become more than just a job, it was a purpose. One afternoon, Alice paid a visit, as she occasionally did, moving quietly through the aisles with her usual warmth. Employees greeted her with smiles, customers waved, and she returned each gesture with gentle kindness. Watching her, Brad couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the journey he had undergone and the leader he had become under her quiet guidance. When she reached the front of the store, Brad approached her with a wide smile. "Alice," he greeted her, his tone filled with genuine affection. "It's always wonderful to see you here." She looked up at him, her eyes sparkling with pride. "Thank you, Brad. Every time I come here, I see more of the heart this place was meant to have. You've done a fine job keeping Brightmart's spirit alive." Brad's cheeks reddened slightly, a rare but familiar response to her praise. "I couldn't have done it without you, Alice. You've taught me more than I ever thought possible about what it means to lead and to serve." Alice chuckled softly, waving a hand in dismissal. "All I did was remind you of what was already there. You learned the most important lessons on your own." She paused, looking around the store as if seeing it for the first time. "This place, it's a reflection of the people in it. A store is just walls and shelves without the heart that its people bring." Brad nodded, feeling the truth of her words sink in deeply. Brightmart's transformation had come from more than policies and practices, it had come from a shift in perspective, a new understanding of what leadership could truly mean. He had learned to see his team not just as employees but as people with stories, dreams, and lives that mattered beyond the store walls. "Alice," Brad said, "I know you haven't been involved with the day-to-day running of the store for some time, but would you consider visiting more often? Your presence is invaluable here. I think the staff and the community would love to see more of you." Alice smiled, her gaze thoughtful. "I appreciate that, Brad. I've watched over Brightmart for many years, and it brings me great joy to know it's in capable hands. I'll visit as often as I can, but this place now belongs to all of you. You've made it yours." Her words resonated deeply with Brad, stirring in him a renewed sense of responsibility and purpose. He understood that Brightmart wasn't his to own but to care for, to protect the legacy that Alice had built. With each decision he made, each conversation he had with a customer or employee, he worked to honor the values she had instilled in him. Later that evening, as Brad was closing up, he took a moment to stand near the community board. Tyler had done a fantastic job curating it, and now it was filled with posters, announcements, and notes from the townspeople. Each piece represented a part of the town's fabric, and it was clear that Brightmart had become a vital part of that fabric, too. One note in particular caught Brad's eye. It was a small, handwritten message pinned to the corner of the board. The handwriting was neat but shaky, and the message read, "Thank you, Brightmart, for being a place that feels like family. Brad smiled to himself, feeling a surge of pride and warmth. This was the heart of Brightmart, the family Alice had built, the legacy he now worked to uphold. It wasn't just a grocery store. It was a home for everyone who walked through its doors, a place where they could feel valued and welcomed. As Brad locked up the store, he felt a deep satisfaction settle over him. The journey had been unexpected, full of hard lessons and moments of self-reflection, but it had been worth every step. He had learned, not only about leadership but also about himself. Alice had taught him that real success wasn't measured by numbers or efficiency, it was measured by the lives he touched and the community he served. Walking out into the quiet evening, Brad took a last look at the brightly lit sign that read Brightmart, his heart filled with a quiet sense of fulfillment. He knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the wisdom and compassion he had gained from Alice's guidance. She had given him the greatest gift a mentor could give, the ability to see beyond himself, to see the people who made Brightmart what it was. And with that realization, Brad felt ready for whatever the future would bring, knowing that Brightmart was more than just a part of the community, it was a part of him.